You know, sometimes marriages fail or end in death, but instead of staying single, more couples are choosing to remarry. And dealing with your financial well-being could be confusing during this time. But our financial advisor and Vice President of Charles Schwab and Company, Mike Bonds, is here to talk about that. Thanks for coming in, Mike.
Good morning.
So this is the type of situation where we should not really try to forget about the life that we lived, but rather you want to take a look at this being a positive.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you're going to add somebody to your life, you want it to be an addition, not a subtraction. So there's some things you need to kind of put in place, and because you did live a life, especially in your golden years, prior to, and if you've had a spouse that passed away, the last thing you want to do is forget about that life, because it means a lot to you and your family. So there's some things you want to put in place. One might be a prenuptial agreement. I know there's a negative connotation to that, but in reality it actually protects you, it protects your fiance and your families. So things you need to think about are things like, are you going to share your assets? A good rule of thumb here is things that you've done or acquired prior to the marriage stay that way. Things that you acquired during marriage become joint.
Now, should you talk clearly? Are you encouraging to just go ahead and be honest and talk about this?
You have to talk about all of these kinds of things to get them out in the open. The other thing that's really critical too is, what are you going to do with your houses? You know, you're going to live in your house, you're going to live in your fiance's house, or you're going to sell those and buy a new house. That
kind of goes along the question of who should be responsible, financially responsible for what.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah, because there's a lot of implications when you're buying and selling homes. How long have you lived in the home? What are the tax consequences if you decide to sell it? And how you're going to title the house if you decide to stay in one of the houses. Other things like how you're going to handle your day-to-day expenses.
Yeah.
Usually the mantra of yours, mine, and ours works well, because then you have your own independent finances, but you share the day-to-day expenses. You need to talk about debt. Although you're not responsible for your fiance's debt, nor are they responsible for your debt if you get married, you do have to talk about how you're going to satisfy the debt, because that could eat away at what your cash flow is.
So communicate all of this. What about medical insurance? Well, you mentioned the debt, but medical insurance.
You have to make sure, always talk about the medical coverage that you have, long-term care coverage that you may have. But the prenup also prepares you for the worst case scenario if things don't work out.
That's interesting that you point that out, because so many of us, I think, just fall into the whole idea of, oh, the prenup is bad, and you know, why do that?
It's a mindset, but in reality it helps get things in the open in the very beginning, because you're talking about everything, all of your finances and everything. But it's also, it's a time for you to take a look at your estate plan, make sure that you're refining it a little bit. And because the last thing you want to do is forget about the life that you lived, or forget about what your former spouse really may have wanted for their desires.
And so you have prenup, the prenup agreement as one of the first things. You talked a little bit about the assets, revise and refine estate plans.
And last but not least, you want to incorporate your kids into the process. You want to let them in on the decisions, why they're being made. You may want to give them copies of your prenup. You may want to give them copies of your trust, those types of things, because those years that are your golden years need to remain golden. You want them to be positive. And hopefully they can accept that. They can go into your next stage of your life with confidence, with support, and with a loving memory of the past.
And so even if you're younger, and let's say you're not at the point where you want to remarry, but it's important to have these type of discussions. Should you, for whatever reason, get a divorce, or perhaps encounter death in your relationship, and then eventually you want to remarry,
you always want to be open about this stuff. The last thing that you want is a surprise. Because I'm married and I've got $90,000 in student loans I still haven't paid, or those types of things, especially if you're younger. That doesn't really apply to folks that are in their retirement years, but still, you want that to be positive. So I want to keep that in mind.
And in your experience, when you've dealt with prenups and couples in this situation, is there hesitation? Do you find that one or the other is hesitant about doing a prenup?
I think you have to get over the hump of the concept of what a prenuptial agreement does. It's really a positive thing, although in our society today people take it very negatively, like, well, I'm just preparing for the end, and that's not really the case. Especially once you're retired and you've already had a life before. It allows you to make sure that you remember that life, that you financially prepare for the inheritance of all of that for your kids, your responsibility to your kids, your grandkids, to any dependent family members. all of that is brought up and it's clearly understood amongst everyone, so these aren't mysteries moving forward.
Very good. Mike, always a pleasure. Always such useful information, perhaps, for some of us.
Well, Merry Christmas.
Thank you very much, Mike.